She's a landscape architect now working largely in the urban environment, and I know that you'll have plenty of questions to pelter Rachel with. Please welcome Rachel de Lambert.
Thanks, Mike. I feel slightly humbled standing here. I've been here all today, and the speakers who have lined up before you have really been incredibly impressive, and I think had a lot to say to help you think about the Christchurch that we will see in the future. So what I was asked to do today was to provide a bit of background around my vision around what Christchurch might be, to perhaps help you think about some of the opportunities that Christchurch does have. I wanted to start with this slide, which you'll notice is a bit of an old picture of the square, but it was the postcard that one of my sisters, Diana, sent me after the September earthquake. And I wanted to begin because, as Mike said, I now live in Auckland, but Christchurch is my home, it's where I grew up. But I want to recognise that I don't live here, and it's you who have been through the terrible things that Christchurch has experienced. And so I'm not trying to speak as one of you. I recognise that you've experienced different things to me, but what I want to try and do is put out some thoughts that might help you in terms of the sort of Christchurch we do recreate. So, I mean, there is a Christchurch that we all know and love, and I think, to me, that Christchurch has really good bones. It has some incredibly good starting point things that suggest how we should rebuild Christchurch. Christchurch is a flat city, and coming from a hilly city, that flatness is something that is good about an urban form, a place that's easy to get around. But it also has the Avon as a really key natural element of the city that is part of the city's identity and something that's important going forward in terms of a way of developing a new form of the way the city might address that natural feature. We also know that Christchurch is a planned city, and the grid, the cross axes, the diagonal axes, the squares, those things are really, I think, valuable to Christchurch's identity and the way, again, we might think going forward about how we think of the city. So the question for us all now, and for you to use this opportunity to really think about, is, so what for the future of Christchurch? And to me, I think one of the critical things about how we do recreate, and I liked the way that word recreation was used, how we recreate Christchurch as a city really does need to do two things. It needs to look to the past and to understand Christchurch's heritage, and to use that understanding and the memory of the Christchurch that we have had as a way to inform the future city. And I agree with Peter that that needs to be a new Christchurch, not one that's replicating a past, but one that's taking Christchurch into the future. Now, I think it is really important that this city that you rebuild for Christchurch is about the future, about future generations, and what your children and grandchildren will grow to know as Christchurch. But it's also really important that, the past and the heritage of the city is part of the way that Christchurch is informed, the new Christchurch is informed in terms of what it does look and feel like for you all. And I guess when I was asked to sort of develop, what's some thinking around some form of vision for Christchurch in the future, that challenged me to kind of think about, what is this new Christchurch? And to me, the 21st century garden city, the garden city of the future, seemed to have some resonance around the sort of place that Christchurch should be looking to recreate. And the core components to me of that, and you will have heard these repeated over and over today, and I feel good that that's the case. It is around the people, the environment, commerce, and heritage, and I think those things are really important to inform Christchurch as you go forward to rebuild. So people, clearly Christchurch, and again a message you've heard often, it needs to be a safe place, a place that people trust and grow to love again. And I think that that's important. but also cities need to be, and good cities are places that are great for children and families. And I think that that's something that is important in terms of the way we think about rebuilding, recreating Christchurch, is creating a place that is great for families and children, but also a place that is about relaxation and enjoyment. Christchurch has always had that identity. How do we grow that and really make it a central part of this new Christchurch? Recreation is important, and the way we use the city as part of our recreational public realm, and also a place to have some fun and to enjoy family together. And I think that sort of critical thing around being a place for family, for people, and for the enjoyment of Christchurch people. And I think if you get it right for Christchurch and your families and your community, then it will be a great city for visitors and tourists as well. So I think, it is about you and getting the city right for you, and then growing it for those other uses as well. I think, inner city Christchurch, within the 4 avenues, it will need to be an important place to live. I think there'll need to be more people living within the 4 avenues as part of the sort of sustainable, vibrant city that you do want to create. Peter talked about the fact that there are villages forming and that they will be an important part of Christchurch as you move forward. But I think also you need to know that you have a city centre, which is a vibrant central place, which is the heart of the city. And part of that is living in the city as well. And I guess, to me, there's an opportunity about living in a slightly different way in Christchurch than the way we have in the past, and that there are good models for that all over the world. And this is just one little series of slides looking at a place called Malmo in Sweden, where on a brownfield site they have built a new community. And to me, it's an interesting community because it is very mixed in terms of its styles of housing. There are single dwellings, apartments, duplexes and terraces in very close proximity, and it's created a community that does have a unity and a belonging together. And I think some of these images, they're not telling you that this is what Christchurch should look like, but I think they're giving you perhaps some models around how we might live in the central city again in a different way to the ways that you have in the past. And here in Malmo you can see that mix of types of housing very close together, creating a diversity of the community, and that there are small spaces within that are about collecting open space, play, and gathering, and also streets, which are very much about a shared space where cars don't dominate, but people are part of a shared street environment. And David talked about that human scale in our cities, and that's really important. And I think the small spaces that grow together to make the city and to make a residential city are really important. Malmo has also had very challenging standards around sustainability, and one of those elements of sustainability is around stormwater management, and the opportunity perhaps to think about our stormwater and some of those elements of sustainability in a different way within our residential environments. But it's also, in Malmo, a very green, higher density location where gardens and the spaces that people sort of inhabit in their daily life are very much part of the shared environment of the street. So I think all of those things are things that, again, we could think about in terms of how we might live in the city. There are obviously lots of other forms of inner city revitalisation happening all over the world, and there are just a couple of slides of places. Again, this is Copenhagen, so David's home city, where along the river there's brownfield redevelopment and urban residential environments very much around a cycling and pedestrian environment, different forms of residential. And here in Hamburg, which in the Hafen city, where there's a huge redevelopment going on, that mixing of commercial and residential in very close proximity. So where you have vertically separated commerce and residential, but in close integration with each other, creating that vibrance of a new city place. And I think when we live in the city, you also need those spaces, the parks and the recreational places close by as part of the community, so that when you're living, you're also living a holistic lifestyle in that one place. Again, David talked about the 5-minute walk and the pint, but it's also about providing within that 5 minutes access to recreational open space for families, and making a very diverse community for people to live in. And those spaces need to have a range of character and quality so that we can have an urban environment which is at a high quality but also accommodates a lot of people to live. I think one of the next things about what Christchurch needs to be is that it needs to be a place that's easy to get around. I think the flatness helps in that respect, but I think also the whole debate around multimodal forms of transport. I mean, obviously, I think we still do need cars in the city. There's still a form of transport that's going to be important to us, whether petrol or electric powered in the future. But I guess I'm in the camp that says we definitely need to two-way the one-way streets again. You know, I'm just old enough to remember driving the wrong way down a street that used to be two-way and turned into one-way. And I think that that form of re-looking at Christchurch's transport network is really important. But, you know, the city also needs to be about great streets for walking and people. Those smaller scale streets where people mix in a finer grain within the city and using the lanes for that purpose. You know, creating streets where the cars don't dominate, where people and other modes of transport do work together. And, you know, clearly in Christchurch, to me, cycling and bikes are a critical part of the city and the way that we should be able to move around it. And I guess I was a bit like this little girl on her four-wheeler when I started my school life. You know, I spent my life cycling to school, and, you know, as I got a bit older in life, the socialisation, meeting at the Garden Road Bridge with my bunch of schoolmates and riding in a flock to school, those things were really important about the socialisation of the city. And I think if Christchurch can return to some forms of those more, you know, less energy requiring but also more socialising ways of moving around the city, that would be a great part of the new recreated Christchurch. I mean, walking's also an important thing in the central city, and, you know, thinking about climate and making a good place in the inner city to move around at all times of the year. You know, we know Christchurch gets really hot, and it also is very cold and windy, and the easterly comes up. So thinking about climate and environment for walking, and, you know, perhaps thinking about some forms of more enclosure as well, not creating malls in the city, but thinking about winter and summer in the city for pedestrians. And then there's the issue of public transport, and clearly it's not a tram and it's not a bus, but it's that message around public transport has to be a key part of the solution for Christchurch. I think, you know, taking the trams and making them part of our commuter network of transport, not a tourist thing, but the way we connect our communities together, that would be a great positive for Christchurch in the way we look to recreate the city. I think Christchurch has the opportunity to be a much greener city. And, you know, this is Paris, but, you know, Christchurch has a fantastic ecology. You know, we should be embracing Christchurch's Indigenous ecology as well, and looking to create a city which both recognises the natural history of Christchurch as well as the cultural heritage of the city. So how do we do that in a way that, you know, recognises those layers in our city? But, you know, also creating and establishing new great civic space as part of the city, and looking at, you know, green technologies which don't actually have to be high-tech. You can get some very beautiful solutions in a green sense about some really simple moves. And I think, you know, that's a good opportunity when we get to the point of thinking about buildings, about how we look to creating greener buildings which are part of the urban fabric of Christchurch. You know, and it doesn't have to be high-tech and tricky and difficult, but we can create a much more beautiful city just by thinking about the introduction of horizontal and vertical green as part of the city we experience on a day-to-day basis. You know, and at a really small scale as well as the big. And I think, just getting towards the end of my message, I think Christchurch, you know, we have the opportunity. Peter talked about an iconic city. Well, I guess what I'd like to suggest is that maybe it's more about rethinking a city that looks a bit different to the Christchurch that we knew, but that which recognises our heritage and history and then creates a new identity for the city about the future, about being a place that in the future is visited because of what Christchurch did, because of the September earthquake. rather, or the February earthquake rather, and that becomes the sort of the new identity for what makes Christchurch a known place on a world basis.